goes to you, Mitch Snyder.
Hi. I have more experience, but I don't think I have more pizzazz. She went already, look at that. Actually, the name of the group is the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and everybody always gets it wrong. A couple of years ago, some of us appeared before a judge, a very wizened old man, and he said, "You're part of that group, aren't you, the Community for Non-Creative Violence?" So there have been some very amazing takeoffs on the name. A couple of things first. First, I want to express appreciation for the invitation to come here and to talk with you. And I want to thank you for coming here instead of going somewhere else. I appreciate that. A small piece of business. There's a case of books out back like that. Oh, that's very good. Look at it. It's called Homelessness in America, and it's written by a couple of us from the community, and I always have to carry a case with me when I leave because people in the community wrap it up and give it to me. And it's very heavy, and I really don't like carrying it back. So anybody who wants to get a copy, please feel free to do so. There's about 34 books in the case, and my hope is that I don't have to carry any of them back to Washington. And they make reasonably good reading, I think. Well, first, a couple of words of explanation about the group that I come from and I'm a part of. As has been said, it's called the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and it came into existence just about 16 years ago, back in 1970. We're essentially a religious community, although religious belief isn't a prerequisite for membership, and we're non-hierarchical, which means everybody is just a member. Our decisions are made consensually, and there are about 50 of us in the community, all of whom work as volunteers. Nobody in CCNV receives a salary because we believe that what we're doing is right and necessary, and that's our reason for doing it, not an income. The community initially came together in response to the war in Vietnam. I'm sure it wouldn't be the case here, but I've spoken to some people at high schools who don't know what Vietnam was. And that's very scary, because that's why we're going into Nicaragua. It's because people forgot what Vietnam was. But we came into existence because of that war and because of an essentially religious opposition to it. And it took about a year or two for us to begin to understand that there was a domestic counterpart to the violence of Southeast Asia. And for us as a community, that was manifested most clearly in the existence within blocks of the White House of people who went to bed hungry every night. And there were, in fact, and still are, in fact, people who lived within blocks of the White House who had no bed to go to. And so in 1972, we opened up a soup kitchen. With the opening of that kitchen 14 years ago, we began to work much more closely with the poor and the destitute and to advocate on their behalf. Now, back in 1972, we served a couple of hundred people a day with a hot meal. But we realized that people coming in for a bowl of soup also had a pretty wide range of other needs. And so today, our community serves somewhere around 2,000 people a day with food, medical care, clothing, shelter, and a variety of other services. In December 1976, we opened up the living room of one of our houses. The occasion that prompted that was Christmas Eve. Our community had developed a 3 or 4 year old tradition of opening the soup kitchen through the night on Christmas Eve so that people could come inside, because that's a very reasonable and very decent way to spend Christmas Eve. And it was a long night and a fairly quiet one, and some of us were sitting around talking and realizing that that was a good thing to be doing on Christmas Eve, which of course was why we're doing it. But then the question was raised, why only Christmas Eve? What about the other 364 days? Do people have any less right to come inside, and do we have any less responsibility to allow them to? And so that question was brought back to the community, and in spite of the fact that we were very, very busy doing a great many things, we decided to open up our living room. And it was the act of opening our living room to people sleeping on the street that began to deepen our involvement and broaden our involvement with people who are destitute. And I can remember within a couple of months of that decision to open up our living room, sitting around and articulating what has become our, not just our position, but what has become our area of responsibility and focus. And what we decided was that we would do whatever we had to do and whatever we could do to guarantee the creation of adequate and accessible space offered in an atmosphere of reasonable dignity for every man, woman, and child, first in Washington and second throughout the nation, who needed and wanted to get in off the street. Now, we didn't find a tremendous amount of sympathy or support back in 1976 for the idea that either homeless people have a right to a place to stay or that we as human beings and citizens have an absolute responsibility to provide it. What we found instead was a great deal of ignorance and a great deal of fear, which are themselves the product of the awesome distance between people who have no place to lay their heads and people who don't. And because of that distance, we discovered that the homeless were, and still are, essentially missing persons, people who are absent from our deliberations, from our decision-making processes, from our consciousness, and from our lives. And because of that, in vitreous misery, they live and die. Now, in order to reduce that distance and to overcome that ignorance, we realized that it was necessary to speak and act prophetically and dramatically and symbolically. And so we broke down doors. I mean, we literally took doors off buildings and went in. And we occupied those buildings in the name of eminent domain and in the name of human need. We erected 10 cities, we called them Reaganville, across the street from Lafayette Park. Because you see, back in the Depression and before the Depression, we had in this country places called Hoovervilles that were usually cardboard or tin encampments where very poor people lived. And Mr. Hoover was credited, at least, for helping tremendously to create that situation. And we decided to erect those 10 cities and name them Reaganville, A, to help focus attention and make more visible people who had become less visible, and as a way of trying to acknowledge Mr. Reagan's involvement in helping to exacerbate the problem of homelessness in America. We did and still do serve Thanksgiving dinner in downtown Washington. Each year we've done that at Lafayette Park, again across from the White House. This year we'll be moving the dinner to the Capitol grounds, but we serve a couple of thousand people at a time, a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. We poured blood, both at public buildings and in cathedrals and churches, as a way of making visible the consequence of government inaction and the religious community's unwillingness to come to grips with the problem of homelessness. We were arrested, we spent time in jail and on the streets, and we fasted. Now, there is, as I'm sure you understand, a tendency to equate the message and the messenger. And so we weren't very popular back then. As a matter of fact, with a fair number of people, we're still not very popular. We made people very angry and very defensive because of what we said and what we did. We made them very uncomfortable. But it's also true that at the same time, grudgingly, haltingly, Americans finally began to see. Many for the first time. And what they began to see were the homeless. And they began to understand a little better that in spite of all those very comfortable and familiar stereotypes and images with which we defend ourselves and which allow us to go to bed more comfortably at night while others remain outside, people began to understand a little better that those comfortable stereotypes and images were in fact very old and very outworn and very irrelevant. And because of that, people began to comprehend the enormity of the problem and the diversity of the people on the street. Now, while it's true that that understanding is a good thing because it's led to a deeper involvement on the part of a great many people and a deeper concern, and it's also, I think, been translated out politically at primarily the state and local level in deepened involvement. It's also true that there are now many, many more people on the streets than there were 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. As a matter of fact, every year, every month, every day, there's more people forced out onto the streets and into destitution. The question of whether consciousness is rising faster than the numbers, nobody can say for sure, but it's a real race. Now, what that means, taken out of the abstract, is that every day there's more pain and more loneliness. Every day there's more injury and illness of every kind. During the winter months there's more pneumonia, there's more frostbite and gangrene, there's more suffering of every kind imaginable, and of course there are many more needless deaths, and that increases inexorably year after year and month after month. Now, I would like to share with you a brief reading. It's written by Thomas Wolfe, who is one of my favorite authors, and it's about a scene and a situation in New York City, which is the city of my birth. So I would like to share that with you. It was his custom almost every night at 1 o'clock or later to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. And night after night, with a horrible fascination, he used to go to the public latrine or comfort station, which is directly in front of the New York City Hall. One descended to this place down a steep flight of stairs from the street, and on bitter nights he would find the place crowded with homeless men who had sought refuge there. Here in New York, in this obscene meeting place, these derelicts came, drawn into a common stew of rest and warmth and a little surcease from their desperation. George had never before witnessed anything to equal the indignity and the sheer animal horror of the scene. There was even a kind of devil's comedy in the sight of all these filthy men squatting upon those open doorless stools. The sight was revolting, disgusting, enough to render a person forever speechless with pity. The Woolworth building was not 50 yards away, and a little further down were the silvery spires and needles of Wall Street, great fortresses of stone and steel that housed enormous banks. The blind injustice of this contrast seemed the most brutal part of the whole experience, for there, all around him in the cold moonlight, only a few blocks away from this abyss of human wretchedness and misery, blazed the pinnacles of power where a large portion of the entire world's wealth was locked in mighty vaults. Now, Wolfe wrote those words back in 1930, at the height of the Great Depression. Yet, when I moved to the streets of Washington for 4 months in the winter of 1980, I discovered that almost nothing had changed. Occasionally, very late at night, I would leave the little heat grate, little 4 by 4 foot piece of steel, that I slept on. It's where the steam rises from the underground heating ducts that snake their way through Washington. Occasionally I would get up at night and I would go to the only public bathroom open in the city of Washington at night, and it's one right beside the Washington Monument. I found there, in that bathroom, in 1980, what Wolfe had found in New York in 1930. True, the trappings of economic power which he saw in New York, for me, had been replaced by the manifestations of political power, the power of empire. But the contradiction that Wolfe found, just as the contradiction that I found, remains the same. And the contradiction is this. In this, the wealthiest nation this earth has ever seen, 2 to 3 million human beings whose only common bond or crime is that they are either permanently or temporarily disabled in some way, are eating out of garbage pails and sleeping on the streets. Now, in light of that, I think it's fairly obvious that something is wrong. And while I think that we, all of us, expend a fair amount of time and energy discussing and discerning the root causes of poverty and injustice in our society, I think what we refer to as the roots are in fact more often the branches. See, the underlying truth with which we must at some point come to grips with is that neither the existence of millions of Americans at our feet nor the other manifestations of injustice or evil within our society are temporary aberrations. They are, in fact, the logical, predictable, and inexorable consequence of our very energetic efforts to build a livable and sane society on a foundation of rampant individualism and greed. You see, that idea is irrational and inhuman and dangerous. And so, not terribly surprisingly, what we have managed to construct is a society that is irrational, inhuman, and extremely dangerous. Now, there are some things that I think that each of us, regardless of our individual nature or gifts, and I think we can all agree that human beings are unique, but I think, bless you again, but I think that each of us can also agree, or should, that there are some things that each of us are bound to do, at least if we're to have any hope of continuing on into the 21st century, and if we're to have any hope of creating a world which is more rational and more just and more livable than the one we have now. The first thing we need to do is to break down the walls and the multitudinous layers of bureaucracy that insulate, isolate, and segregate us, not just from one another, but from the truth as well. You see, we are only able to abide evils like homelessness or hunger because they haven't yet come to affect us, at least not where it counts, not in the depths of our relationships, and most certainly not in our own flesh. We have to acknowledge by the way we live that there is, in fact, a God, and that it is a just and loving God, and that all of us are simply members of one family, one community, and that the human community is but part of one very large and very beautiful creation, and that anything that reinforces and supports the unity of that creation is to be supported and is to be pursued. Anything that denies that unity and that oneness is evil and needs to be resisted and overcome. What that means, again, in the concrete, is that we have to begin to act as though that person who we see when we go from class to home, or when we walk down the street, we have to begin to act as though that person were our sister or brother, or our mother or father, or our son or daughter, or we ourselves, because in fact that's exactly what that person is. It also seems to me that we have to act in ways that are responsible and with a proportionate sense of urgency. Now, what I mean by that is, what do you think would happen if tonight, right now, while we are gathered here, there were an earthquake or a flood in New York City and 25 or 50,000 people were displaced? I'll tell you what would happen. The governor and the mayor would declare a state of emergency. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army and Catholic Charities would rush in supplies and personnel. School gymnasiums would open. Churches would fling open their doors. And everybody would do anything they had to do to provide what those people needed to carry them through that emergency and to help them get back on their feet. Yet, tonight, while we gather here, there are an estimated minimum of 50 to 60,000 homeless people in the city of New York. Most of them are children. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that there's more homeless children in the city of New York now than there were in Dresden in Germany following the firebombing at the end of World War II. And I'm sure you've all seen pictures of all of those children running around the rubble. Well, what is the difference? And is there any difference between someone who winds up on the street because of an earthquake, or because of unemployment, or because of mental disability, or old age, or the absence of affordable housing? And the answer is, to that person out on the streets, there is no difference whatsoever. But there does seem to be a difference for those who are in a position and have the resources to do something about it. Now, don't just look at how we respond to the fact that there are people all over our streets and that we are doing relatively little in support of them or to help them get off the streets. Look at how we respond to the threat of nuclear war, to the fact that every minute in this world, 43 people starve to death, most of them children under 5. Look at how we respond to the destruction or the threatened destruction of our ecology, which means the land, the air, and the water on which we rely for our continued existence. Our responses are not only disproportionate, they are irrational, because you're talking about life-threatening situations. You know, if you'll remember, not very long ago, the President of the United States met with Mr. Gorbachev in Iceland and failed to come away with an agreement to limit or reduce the spread of nuclear weapons. We are threatened with imminent destruction because of the existence of those weapons. And what do? Those who are most involved occasionally will demonstrate, or they will go to meetings. Yet the danger posed by those weapons is no less or no more imminent than the danger that would be posed by this building bursting into flames and burning all around us. We would not have a demonstration. We would not hold a meeting to discuss what to do. We would go running out of here as though our very lives depended on it, which they would. And yet our very lives depend on having air to breathe and water to drink and to grow food with, and land that can produce something other than dust. Now, it's a reasonable question to ask why we respond irrationally. And there are a number of reasons, but primary among those reasons is something for which we have dedicated a holiday. Next month, people across the country will celebrate Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is the time that we set aside to express our appreciation for our great abundance and wealth as a nation. It is, in fact, our great abundance and wealth as a nation that is driving us stark raving mad. There was, some years back, a television documentary special put together on great apes. It was done by anthropologists, and they conducted a series of experiments with great apes. Now, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, great apes live in a tribe. There are a number of young and a number of females and one dominant male. That's the structure of the great ape family. The male is the forager. He goes out and he gets the food, brings it back, and then each of the members of the tribe get their share. And intuitively, that food is divided up in a very rational way. Those who are bigger and those who expend the most energy get the most food, and so on down the line. What anthropologists discovered, whenever they put the male to sleep and allowed him to wake up on top of a couple of 1,000 pounds of bananas, was that this amazing phenomenon occurred. The ape would sit on top of the pile of bananas and become extremely aggressive. Now, apes are not normally aggressive. They're very gentle and very civilized creatures. They don't eat meat and they don't attack things needlessly, and they're just very, very low-key and very gentle animals. But this ape would go berserk whenever he found himself sitting on top of this pile of bananas. He would become aggressive towards any of the other apes that approached the pile of bananas. He would try and hurt them if they came too close. And never at any time did he eat any of the bananas. He just sat there protecting them, never even enjoying them. And then they would put the ape back to sleep and allow him to wake up with a bunch of bananas by his side. And instantly, the change would occur. He would take his share, the rest would get their share. What the anthropologists concluded was that apes are incapable of dealing with excess. It drives them mad, makes them crazy. Now, the next time you walk into a very large supermarket, you just take a look around and you start thinking, or try to start thinking, about what that represents and what difference there is between that big pile of bananas that drove the ape mad and the kind of excess that we have in our own nation. Now, it also seems to me that if we're to have any hope of surviving as a people and as a world, that we have to better understand the nature of change, because I think everybody essentially wants the same thing. I mean, we would all say that we would want a world that is just and fair and equitable and balanced and healthy and not violent and not warlike. I mean, we would all say that, I think. But bringing that into fruition and creation is something different than just saying it. I remember during the height of the war years in Vietnam, President Nixon used to flash the peace sign. Now, he used to flash the peace sign while he was bombing Cambodia back into the Stone Age. And other people used to give the peace sign when they were being carried away after resisting the war. So what people said and what people did, even though on the surface they were very similar, in reality they were very, very different. Now, a couple of years back in 1984, as a matter of fact, just around the time of the presidential election, there were 12 members of the community, my community, who were fasting. And we fasted for 51 days in order to encourage the president to agree to provide funds to renovate a big federal building in downtown Washington that we operate as a shelter. And on the 51st day, the president, 2 days before the election, the president agreed to provide the funds. They immediately, within just a few days, began reneging on that promise. But that commitment was made, and there was a lot of publicity around that. And a lot of calls started coming in from all kinds of people. And one call that came in to me was from a man in Denver who called up and said, "Hi, I'm a man from Denver, and I operate a very big foundation." And he did, and it is, and was a very large foundation with a great deal of money. And he said that one of the principals, one of the family members, who worked in Washington for a senator, was very supportive of our work. and she wanted to provide us with a good chunk of money. And I said, great, send it over. And he said, well, no, she'd like to come and visit, and I'd like to come and visit the shelter and see what you do. So we arranged for him to come a couple of weeks later, and I met him on the steps of the shelter, and he arrived about 10 or 15 minutes before she was due so that we could talk a little bit. And he said, he just started explaining what the foundation did and asked a few questions about what we did. And it dawned on me after a couple of minutes that I should clarify something for him. And I did. I explained that we were not tax exempt. It doesn't mean we make a profit. We're non-profit. We're just not a legal organization that files with the Internal Revenue Service for what is commonly referred to as a 501c3, which is a designation that anyone who gives you money can write it off their taxes. Now, I explained that to him, and he looked at me very, very strangely. Matter of fact, all the color drained out of his face. As a matter of fact, I thought other things were going to start to drain out. I was expecting to see a little puddle form at his feet because he really wasn't expecting me to say that. So he said, well, we can help you become tax exempt. I said, listen, we're 15 years old. We don't need to become tax exempt because if we wanted to do it, we figured out a long time ago how to do it. We don't want to do it. And he said, well, then we can funnel the money to you through another organization. I said, we don't want to funnel the money to us through another organization. If we wanted to be tax exempt, we would fill out the forms and file the papers, and we would do what we had to do it. And if we're not willing to do it, then we're not willing to let somebody else do it for us. He got incredibly agitated, really upset. He started waving his finger in my face and making all kinds of noises. And finally, I said to him, listen, brother, what's the matter with you? Why are you so upset? And he said, I used to be like you. Now, he was wearing a three-piece suit, and I was dressed like this, so I didn't know whether he meant that he used to dress differently. So I said, what do you mean you used to be like me? And he said, I used to be a radical. Now, that always makes me very uncomfortable because I don't have the slightest idea what a radical is. I mean, I know who we are, which are just people trying to live a reasonable way, but he perceived that as being radical. And he said, I used to be like that. And I said, well, what happened to you? Which was not a good thing to say. Got a little bit more agitated. And he said, I learned. I said, okay, tell me, what'd you learn? He said, I learned that if you want to get anything done, you gotta compromise. Now, the man from Denver, pardon the expression, was full of shit. You don't get anything done by compromising. And we've got a whole nation of people that compromise virtually everything in sight. Their beliefs, their integrity, their values. I mean, we've made a society on the idea that compromising everything of value is the way to make a better world. And in fact, that's an absolute lie. See, the truth is that we only begin to get things done, and we only begin to create real change for the better the moment we stop compromising. The moment we stop putting off for next week or next year, the next lifetime, all those wonderful values and ideals and principles that we have been taught, but which we have also been taught really need to be set aside. In order to live and function in the real world, you have got to get along, to go along, you got to compromise. Now, that's not how we're going to create a reasonable and a sane and a just and a livable world. That's how we're going to continue to destroy ourselves and much of creation that surrounds us on this planet. The truth is that we will begin to create real change, and we will begin to help build a world that is worth living in and on when, number one, our actions flow out of our proximity to victims of injustice. And what that means is we have to get out of our very well-insulated little pockets of privilege, and we have to begin to rub shoulders with people who don't look like us, or smell like us, or talk like us, or come out of the same background that we do. When we begin to reduce that distance between ourselves and folks who are suffering horribly as victims of injustice, many things will become much more clear. We have to act with compassion and with love, and not just for the people that we call friend, but for those who are in fact our adversaries. We have to set a criteria for action that is simply and singularly the rightness and the necessity for those actions. Not the effectiveness, not the acceptability, just the rightness. We have to begin to respond to that small inner voice, the voice of conscience when it speaks to us, regardless of where it takes us, because inevitably it will take us to a very good place if we simply let it. We have to act without concern or regard for the cost or the consequences of our actions, or for the effectiveness of those actions. And that last thing is very difficult for us as a people to come to grips with, because we're taught, and it's reinforced daily, that what we do has to achieve results immediately, because we live by instant gratification. If we do something, if we do A and it doesn't yield B immediately, it makes us very nervous, gets us very disillusioned. We burn out. We start looking for other things to do because it hasn't worked. When in fact the truth has always been, and it seems to be easier to understand, or more easily understood by people in the East than by people in the West, that it's only when we give up any concern for the results that we begin to have results. And we have to act with the understanding that each of us will be that which will make all of the difference in the world. Because the truth is that the process of change is as mysterious as it is predictable. Now, I would like to read one final reading that I think sheds some light on what I've just spoken of, that process of change. It's from a book written by a man named Ken Keyes. It's called The Hundredth Monkey. Has anybody ever read that? No. Whoa. There's somebody back there. Thank goodness. It's a very fine little book, and actually the writer is quite well known. But this book he distributed for free all across the country in fairly large quantity. The reason for the title, or the meaning of the title, becomes clear with the reading. The Japanese monkey, Macaca fuscata, has been observed in the wild for a period of over 30 years. In 1952, on the island of Koshima, scientists were providing monkeys with sweet potatoes dropped in the sand. The monkeys liked the taste of the raw sweet potatoes, but they found the dirt unpleasant. An 18-month-old female named Emo found she could solve the problem by washing the potatoes in a nearby stream. She taught this trick to her mother. Her playmates also learned this new way, and they taught their mothers too. Between 1952 and 1958, all the young monkeys learned to wash the sandy sweet potatoes to make them more palatable. Only the adults who imitated their children learned this social improvement. Other adults kept eating the dirty sweet potatoes. Then something startling took place. In the autumn of 1958, a certain number of Koshima monkeys were washing sweet potatoes. The exact number is not known. Let us suppose that when the sun rose one morning, there were 99 monkeys on Koshima Island who had learned to wash sweet potatoes. Then it happened. By that evening, almost everyone in the tribe was washing sweet potatoes before eating them. The added energy of this 100th monkey somehow created an ideological breakthrough. But notice, the most surprising thing observed by these scientists was that the habit of washing sweet potatoes then spontaneously jumped over the sea. Colonies of monkeys on other islands and the mainland troop of monkeys at Takasakiyama Island began washing their sweet potatoes too. Now, think about that for a moment, and think also of a phenomenon that you can observe during a snowstorm, a very intense winter storm. I don't know if you've ever sat and watched out a window while the snow was coming down, but as it does, sometimes millions or even billions of snowflakes will gather on a tree limb. And at some magic moment, one final little snowflake will come down and the limb will drop. Well, the collective weight of all of those little snowflakes is responsible for that limb bending, just as the collective consciousness of all of those monkeys was responsible for something else bending. The last snowflake and the last monkey were no more responsible than the first or the second or those in the middle. And so each of those snowflakes, just like each of those Koshima monkeys, did only their share, no less and no more. And that was enough. Now, it seems to me that you can reduce just about everything that I've said tonight and just about everything that most other people have said on most other nights to one very basic question. And the question is, what does it mean for each of us to do our share, and only our share, as human beings, as people of faith, as citizens, as members of the human community? What does it mean for us to do our share in alleviating injustice, righting wrongs, and creating a world that is truly livable? Now, I can't answer that question for any of you. If I could, believe me, I wouldn't, because it wouldn't really be possible. That's a question that each of us has to come to grips with for ourselves, because that's the basic question of what it means to be a human being. But what I can do is share with you a personal final reflection that I have found helpful in beginning to come to grips with what it means to do my share. As I said before, we operate a very, very large shelter in downtown Washington, just about 6 or 7 blocks from the Capitol and about 10 or 12 blocks from the White House, which is one reason why the administration didn't like it at all. It was too visible. It was right there in the middle of everything. There's approximately 1,000 people who live in that building. And I live in that building. I've lived there a couple of years now. I have on many occasions stood on the front steps and watched as literally hundreds of people have poured into the building. I've seen people without legs, stumbling in on crutches, Vietnam vets who lost their legs in the war. I've seen people in wheelchairs, blind people, a lot of very old folks. Some of them senile, some of them not, but very old people, all bent and curled over and barely able to walk. A lot of mentally disabled people who just kind of mumble to themselves or stare vacantly into space as they walk by. It's a truly pathetic sight, and there's just a tremendous amount of brokenness in that group of people. And I've stood on those steps, and I've watched, and like Wolf says, I was struck silent with pity. But inside I was raging. Inside I was screaming. And what I was saying was, God, look at all these people. They're just innocent human beings. Why do they have to live like this? Do something, God. Do anything you have to do to make it better, because this is crazy. These folks haven't hurt anybody. They haven't done anything wrong. They're not guilty of any crime or any sin. Do whatever you have to do, God, to make it better. And then one night, not all that long ago, I finally came to understand. And what I come to understand was that it's in the existence of those people and in the existence of millions of others just like them throughout this country and throughout this world that God was, in fact, and is, in fact, demanding of me what I was demanding of God. See, God is saying to me, in the existence of those broken people and in the existence of the broken people who surround this campus and who you see from time to time, what I was saying to God. And what God is saying clearly is, do something. Look at all of these innocent people. There's no reason for them to live like this. Do whatever you have to do. Stop whatever you're doing. Do whatever is necessary to make it better, because this is an abomination. This is a vile, sick, vicious thing that's occurring. And if you profess to be a human being or a person of faith, you stop everything. And you make sure that these people can begin to live with human dignity and can begin to live like human beings. You do anything you have to do it now. Because that is what it means to be a human being. That's what it means to be a Christian and person of faith. That's what it means to be a citizen. And that's what it means to be sane. And anything less than doing anything and everything that we can and that we must to alleviate that suffering in our sisters and brothers is a condemnation of everything we stand for, every value that we embrace, and all that we build our lives on. Now, I will stop at that, and then I understand we may take a break for a minute or do something for a minute, and then my hope is that we will come back together to talk to each other. Because to be perfectly honest, I much prefer talking with people than talking to people. Thank you. You have to do something now? Okay, go ahead. You do that. Thank you.
We have just a few real quick announcements before we'll open it up to questions. First of all, thank you very much for the generous gifts of food. We'll be distributing those to an agency in the Milwaukee area. Some people had asked who had forgotten or were unable.
Well, the best thing for anyone to do would be to take that person home. I mean, in reality, that's what we should do, but that's not what's going to occur most often. So short of that, it's good to give people what they need. You can take someone in and buy them something to eat if they ask you for money. You can go in and buy them something hot to eat or drink and bring it out to them. Or you can give them money. And if you give them money and they use that money to buy a bottle of wine, that's perfectly okay, because that's what it's going to take for them to get through the night. When I lived out on the street, there were many nights when somebody would pass around a bottle of wild Irish rose, and I would drink my share, because sleeping when it's raining or when it's cold, or just being out in the street at all where you're constantly vulnerable and constantly aware of your own vulnerability, is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's a life that's filled with rough edges, and so people are constantly trying to find ways to soften some of those edges. But anything that you can do that says to that person who approaches you, or even to that person who doesn't approach you, but just kind of either sits there or walks by but is obviously destitute and alone, anything that you can do that says to that person that I care about you, you're a human being, you have value to me, is an incredible gift. I sat out on that heat grate for 4 months, right in the middle of downtown Washington. The Interior Department to my left, Bureau of Mining and Indian Affairs on either corner across the street, and Office of Management and Budget at my back. And every day, thousands and thousands of people would walk by. And 2 or 3 blocks away was Constitution Hall, and most nights, thousands of people would come at night. They'd fill up the area, and then they'd get in their cars and disappear again. And during that whole 4 months, something like 10 or 15 people approached and offered me something or said something, and they'll never know how appreciated that approach was. But what about all of those other folks? Now, whether they were afraid because I was different or because I was sitting out there on the street is somewhat immaterial. I mean, the results were that I felt, even though I was out there by choice, probably the only person on the streets of America who was out there by choice, that I felt so dehumanized by having people look through me or not even look at me at all, that within a week of living out there, I could no longer look somebody in the eye. And I still have a very difficult time looking people in the eye or looking into a camera lens head on, because it is so dehumanizing and so debilitating to have people not see you as a human being that it's just a tremendously crushing experience. And if it was that for me, when I was out there for all of these wonderful reasons, what would it be for someone who is out there because they're unemployed or because they're mentally disabled or because they're old and can't afford a place to stay? And the answer is that it's just utter devastation. And you can lighten that and soften that a bit by reaching out to that person. And regardless of how you do it, what you're saying is, you are a human being. And I care enough about you to say that in more than just words. So next time you see a homeless person, stop and do something or say something. Who has a question or a comment? Somebody must. And I have a really hard time seeing distances, so if somebody in the back does, just leap up. I see.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the book. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Mitch, I'm concerned. I cycle in the area. I'm a member of JZU. Sometimes I have food, and sometimes I have money. But my concern is, often people will ask for money. I do give it, but my concern is not that the money won't go towards, food, other than because it's such a drug thing. How do you deal with the money, thing with homeless? It would be a better approach just to carry some food around with you. What?
Either one is appreciated. I mean, people who have jobs get paid every week. Why give people money? Most of them are irresponsible and use it for bad things. It's because it's their money, right? And they have a right to use it any way they wish. We have to respect the rights of people who are poor and destitute and not make a whole range of decisions for them. I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. We serve meat every night in the soup kitchen. Why? Because the folks who come in like meat, and they're not vegetarians. And sometimes very strict vegetarians will come along and say, gee, that's terrible. You shouldn't serve people meat. That's abominable. That's imperialism, the worst kind of imperialism. We're making decisions for other people because we have the power. We have the resources under our control, and so we will give them with the expectation or with the understanding that they will be used the way we want them used, or we won't give them. They, out there, are in the best position to determine what they need to get through the day and the night. And unless we are willing to take them home, which is what they really need, then we have to respect their right to make those decisions. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to understand it necessarily. We don't even have to be supportive of it. What we have to be is non-imperialistic in our attempt to reach out to our brothers and sisters.
The task that you have taken upon yourself of helping the homeless, not only helping them, but like sharing the idea that there is homeless and that we can't help. Doesn't that seem kind of overwhelming at times? I mean, we just got finished with midterms, but we all know midterms are over now. We're doing okay. We're able to make it through, but the homeless are always going to be there, and maybe sometimes you're not always going to be there. Don't you think sometimes it's just, not that it's a waste, but it's just something that maybe you won't get a chance to do all the time?
Well, no, I do it all the time. That's not a concern. We make our own choices, but in terms of it being overwhelming or in some way crushing, no. You have some bad days and some good days, right? Did you ever consider stopping breathing? No. It's very natural, right? You breathe. As long as you're alive, you're going to continue to do it. Well, doing what's right and what's necessary and what is truthful, with a capital T, is no less habit-forming and no less necessary than breathing. And when you spend enough time following the dictates of conscience, or at least trying to, and trying to be of service to human beings around you, number one, you begin to realize that that's the only way to spend your time. Number two, you are doing something. People only burn out or get really frustrated or become overpowered when they bottle things up inside of them, when they are surrounded by pain or by injustice, and they're not really doing very much to try and correct or remedy the situation. Then it can be very debilitating. But we're always doing something to change the situation. I mean, I live in a building with people who are broken. Every time I go in and out of that building, every time I move from floor to floor, there's 20 people that will approach me, asking for some kind of help, asking for some time, asking for something. That doesn't become overpowering because that is simply flowing through me and through the other members of the community and being translated into action. Action that's intended to reduce that suffering and that pain and that injustice. And so we keep getting stronger and stronger because more and more of those people are our friends. They're folks that we love. And because of that, we become increasingly empowered to do whatever we need to do in order to make it better for them. Yes?
I'm curious as to your decision with the 501c3. And I guess the reason in that is if you look at numerous organizations, be it the Rockefeller Foundation or the NAACP or a private university such as this, I think the realization is those organizations see fit to become a tax-exempt organization, and as a result, funding from people like the Kresge Foundation or you look at the city of Minneapolis where a number of digital, some of these organizations fund a group, and it would seem to me internally the man from Denver, whatever his motives were, probably was in a position to fund your agency. And I'm curious, was it a symbolic no, or is it a statement that he's using tax laws to your detriment? I'm missing the reasoning there.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of answers. The first is, I guess, refers back to a statement that you would find in the Bible, and it's that people don't live by bread alone. Now that really is a very profound statement because if you go without eating for any length of time, you understand very quickly that people need sustenance in order to survive. Yet the Bible says there's something that transcends bread. In fact, there is. There's truth, and there's fidelity to God. Now, that man in Denver, no matter how much money he has, can provide us no security at all. That God up above can. And see, our greatest source of security is our effort to be faithful to God and to live in a way that expresses that fidelity. We also are not particularly interested in getting the stamp of approval of the federal government, which is one of the most indefensible, absurd institutions on the face of the earth. We have no desire to be either understandable or acceptable to a government that is patently inhuman and extremely destructive. 2, we're of the opinion, those of us particularly who come out of a Christian or religious perspective, that the world will not be a better place to live, nor will we be better human beings by giving out of our excess. It's only when we give of our substance that real things begin to happen. I know people that make contributions, then write them off, and in fact make a profit on their contributions. That's something we have no need or desire of. It's something that we will not perpetuate or allow people to do, at least in our name. Also, in order to be a 501c3, you have to be non-political. Anyone who thinks hunger and homelessness is non-political does not have the slightest understanding of either politics or hunger or homelessness. So for all of those reasons...
You would say that the NAACP, it would be a non-political organization, and obviously they cannot endorse a presidential candidate.
Well, yes, they can. The NAACP splits themselves up into a fund and into an organization. But that which is 501c3 can't do it. But that's not politics. I'm talking about real politics. But in any event, yeah, the NAACP, in my opinion, does not represent a true medium of change in this country, nor does the Red Cross, nor does the Salvation Army, nor does the Roman Catholic Church, nor does this institution. They are perpetuating a set of values and priorities which are acceptable and understandable to the government. We are not. The change we seek is far deeper than anything that those organizations or those institutions are pursuing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to share an experience and then ask a question.
Sure.
I did some volunteer work at the Sun Kitchen out on O Street.
Mhm.
We did a little casserole when I was in high school, and our parish also took the little casserole down. I went in the mornings before school sometimes. And one time when I was working there, through the soup line came a man, just looked like any other street person, and the guy I was with recognized him as a prof from the University of Virginia.
Mhm.
And to me, I mean, I was a sophomore in high school, it was completely overwhelming. I thought all street people were just street people. I mean, I had no idea that people from all walks of life, I mean, this man, as it turned out, had some emotional problems and had fallen into alcoholism, and his family had broken up, and he'd been booted off staff at UVA, and he ended up coming back to DC where he'd done some of his degree work. And he had nowhere else to go, like he was sleeping on great. Now, I know that St. E's throws a lot of people out. I know that I cannot pronounce this, but the institutions pushing people out because there aren't room. But where does everybody come from? And what can we do to stop people being pushed onto the streets, other than, I mean, the obvious overwhelming social answer?
Well, a couple of responses. The first is that when you begin to work with homeless people intensively, the first thing you discover is that they are just like you. I know reporters who are on the street. People who've written stories about us for major newspapers have shown up at the shelter, homeless. I know doctors, I know a psychiatrist, I know lawyers and professors, all kinds of people that, because of some kind of breakdown, either in themselves or in what sustained them, they just wind up slipping right through the cracks and disappearing onto the streets. More and more people fit that description rather than the old description of alcoholic. The majority of people on the streets aren't alcoholic. Where do they come from? Well, deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals has put a lot of people on the streets. It's estimated that as many as 1 million homeless people in America are mentally disabled. Now, deinstitutionalization was a very good thing, because you shouldn't lock somebody up who talks to themselves or to trees. That's what the prophets used to do, you know. They would have been locked up 30 years ago in this country. Amos, Isaiah, all of those folks would have been institutionalized. And so the court decided rightfully that locking somebody up who wasn't dangerous to themselves or others was a violation of the Constitution. The other side of that was that there were supposed to be community-based facilities created. But they weren't, because nobody really cares very much about poor mentally disabled people, and nobody wants them in their neighborhood, and nobody wants to deal with them, and nobody has the money to deal with them because they don't have much power, much influence. I mean, for instance, every day that Congress operates in Washington, there are roughly 200 meals, cocktail parties, lunches, dinners served by lobbyists. Homeless people cater none of them. They don't have that kind of influence. They don't vote. You know, mentally disabled people don't vote, they don't finance campaigns, and so they've been released out of hospitals, those who are old enough to be hospitalized, and the others just go in and out of the hospitals on a swinging door basis. A lot of people are on the streets because of unemployment. I mean, there's whole industries that are disappearing in America, like steel. What do you think someone who is in their 40s or 50s does if they've been working all of their adult life in the steel industry and their industry folds up on them? Where do you think they go? Nobody wants someone who's in their 40s or 50s in this country to start a new profession, aside from which you, by the time you've reached that age, maintained a certain standard and way of living. And now you're going to take a job for $4 or $5 an hour? So lots of people are committing suicide in places like Pittsburgh. Lots of people are winding up destitute and homeless with their whole families because of unemployment. Physical disability is another cause. Elderly people in increasing numbers who are on fixed incomes aren't able to make it. In city after city across America, affordable housing is disappearing at a frightening rate. You had a theater in this town. What's the name of it? It was just torn down recently. What is it? The Randolph, yeah. It was a single-room occupancy. SROs are places that offer one room, usually with a kitchenette, and they're for people on low income or fixed income. Those places are disappearing here and everywhere else. That, plus the fact that the federal government 5 years ago was spending $32 billion a year to maintain and create public housing, affordable housing, low-income housing, they're down to $9 billion a year. So you have all of those, plus a number of other causes. Institutionalized racism. A disproportionate number of people of color are on the streets of America, because that's the nature of America. A disproportionate number of people of color are living below the poverty line. The breakdown of families. I mean, why are so many old folks out on the street? You know, why is it we can call somebody up in the suburbs of Washington and say, listen, your 85-year-old mother got raped last night. What do you want to do with her? They'll say, well, gee, that's terrible, but Mom is such a problem. That didn't used to happen 10, 20, 30 years ago. If you let your mother live out on the streets, no one would talk to you. You were a social outcast, but now it's perfectly acceptable. And what that reflects is a breakdown of family structure. That's just another manifestation of a breakdown of another institution within our society that is helping put people on the streets. But there's 1 million or 2 or 3 million different reasons. As many people as there are on the streets, there are reasons for people being out there. Who else? I'm an anarchist, so I'll do it any way you want.
I saw a television show a couple of years ago that portrayed about you and your community and what you did. And I just wanted to know if that documentary was very truthful and did it help you in any way?
I'm not sure which one there's a lot of stuff that's been done on us. A couple of years back, there was a piece on 60 Minutes.
No, it was an ABC movie starring Martin Sheen.
Actually, it's amazing how time bends, but that was in May. This May. Yeah, it was a long time ago. A, I didn't see the film. B, our hope and our expectation was not that it would portray us accurately or would communicate our politics, because that's not what Hollywood is about. It's about making things palatable and acceptable and non-threatening. But that it would, we hoped, give people a little bit better sense of who homeless people were, rather than just allowing them to see a person on their screen during the news for 10 or 20 seconds lined up at a soup kitchen or going in to spend the night at a shelter. Much of our work has to do with returning substance to people. That's why a couple of years back we had a very big and very publicly observed funeral at Arlington Cemetery for a man who froze to death in the park across the street from the White House. His name was Jesse Carpenter. Jesse was a war hero, and he died outside because his friend, who was in a wheelchair, couldn't get into any shelter in Washington because at that point none of them were handicapped accessible. And so he remained a hero in freezing to death with his friend out in the park. And so we had a funeral, and a lot of people saw that funeral across the country as a way of helping people understand that folks who you see huddled in doorways or sitting on benches or walking down the street with all of their belongings are human beings with names and faces and histories and identities. And the hope was that the film would accomplish some of that. But we have very, very minimal expectations in everything that we do, and so we are never disappointed. Yes.
How are we going to change the apathy of everyone? I mean, obviously we're going to have to start somewhere. It's going to take a long, long time. But we have to start changing these huge institutions and so on. How do we start?
What you've just said is completely incorrect. You don't have to change anything but you. See, this universe is made up of probably an incalculable number of atoms, right? Nobody has to sit around and organize them. or make them go in the direction they're supposed to go in. They do just fine. And because of that, the universe functions quite well. All that you need to do, and all that you've been given power over, is yourself. The question is, what do you need to do to inject more relevance into your life, to begin to make your life more of a symbol and a sign to other people of what real priorities are and what real values are? And that's the only question that you need to concern yourself with. Because big institutions are just reflections of lots of little people. They don't exist separate and apart from us. Sometimes it feels like they do. And in a sense, they almost do, because the previous generation, of which we were not a part, and the generation before them and the generation before them have left their imprint on those institutions. So they were here, shaped and formed before you were. But they can only find continued existence in the support and in the complicity of all of us. And so all we ever have to worry about is ourselves. Yes?
When you were first introduced, they said that you left the Madison Avenue job, and in your speech you went on to say that homelessness doesn't matter until it hits you somehow. I was wondering if you were willing to share with us what made it matter to you. And also, you spoke about 1,000 residents, and you live in this shelter with 1,000 residents. Is there any kind of turnover rate where they are returned to society?
Well, there was no process in answer to your first question. I woke up one morning in a cold sweat and realized that it was an incredibly stupid way to live. And I mean that. I mean, I did real well. I was doing real well at the time. I used to fly to San Juan for breakfast on Sunday morning and shoot craps or gamble a little bit or go swimming and then come back in the afternoon. And I had charge accounts at all the best taverns in New York. Used to conduct business all over the country, and most people would say that it was a wonderful job and I had a wonderful life. In fact, it was an empty, vacuous, silly way to live. And I can only ascribe it to the grace of God that I was fortunate enough to wake up in a cold sweat and realize that I had to stop doing that, because just about everybody that I worked with, when push came to shove and people got to the point of being honest with each other, really didn't like what they did. They may have been successful at it, but they really didn't like it. They did it because they had to. They did it because they had a car and a home and a family and mortgages and bills and all the rest. And they were trapped. They were just locked in. And I can only ascribe it to the grace of God that I was able to understand that that was not a way to live. I didn't decide to go out and serve homeless people. In fact, I opposed the war in Vietnam for the first few years. What I understood was that that just didn't make any sense. It's like Camus, a philosopher, writes about the two stages of development and change. One is rebellion, the saying of no. You understand what doesn't make any sense and what's stupid, you reject it. And the second part is revolution, or the saying of yes, the embracing of a positive set of values. So at that moment back in 1969, when I woke up in a cold sweat, I knew what I didn't want to be. It took a number of years to figure out who I was called to be. And what was the second part of it?
I was wondering if there was any turnover rate within your shelter where the people are returned to society and do find a home or a job or something?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that, given the minimal stability that the shelter can provide, wind up being able to lead traditional independent lives again. But it's very difficult for folks, not just to find a job, because if you're living in a shelter, it's not a great recommendation for getting work. You know, giving that as your address is not the best way to positively influence an employer, number one. Number two, it's not a real good way to get anything other than a minimum wage, entry-level job. And in Washington, if you're earning minimum wage, you're lucky if you can live out on the street. It's a very expensive town. But in spite of that, there are a considerable number of people that I have seen over the last few years who have been able to move on from there, who will come up one day, shake your hand and say, appreciate the help you provided, and I got a place to live, and I got a job, and see you around sometime. But there's a lot of people for whom a job or that kind of assistance is meaningless. For someone who's 85 years old and senile, a job is not an answer at all. For someone who's mentally disabled, and there's hundreds of people in our building that are mentally disabled. There's the largest mental hospital in America is located in Washington. It's a federal hospital, at least it will be for another year or two, and it's being transferred to the local government. It's called St. Elizabeth's. They just bounce people out on a daily basis. You know, every night we get 1 or 2 people dropped off that are essentially basket cases. What they need is a lot more than just a little bit of support and a little bit of counseling, and there's almost nothing available to them. Yes?
I wanted to first thank you. I very much appreciate what you've said. I think a lot of what you and the community for creative nonviolence is doing is serving as certainly a prophet for many people in this country and beyond, both I think civilly, governmentally, legislatively. I would like to thank religiously. I think it's really a prophetic kind of stance you've taken. And classically, many of the prophets, as you said, have been in jail. I mean, people don't like to hear what they're doing or watch what they're doing because it makes the rest of us very uncomfortable. You had mentioned earlier that in the past 15 years, members of your community have poured blood on both government facilities and also church facilities in order to raise consciousness as a prophetic moment to make people pay some attention, to point at the failure of government and churches in large measure to respond to the kinds of things that are a concern to you, to myself, to many people. Thankfully, happily, there are some persons and groups in the government, I think. There are some cities and communities across this nation who have made some choices to be more responsive to the homeless. Unfortunately, there are many more who have made those opposite choices. Also, hopefully, and not only hopefully, but I think happily, there are a number of churches across the board, all sorts of denominations, nationally and locally, that are also moving in a much more healthy direction in terms of being present to and offering service to the poor, the homeless, the hungry. Milwaukee, I mean, there's probably 4 churches within about, I would say, an 8-block radius of the university that is doing similar things to what you are doing, what your community is doing. Near the end of your talk, you mentioned, or maybe in response to a question, you said something that the government is not being very helpful, and in large measure I would agree. Certainly what's going on in Washington, in large measure, ought to be a scandal to most of us. But you also said churches, the Catholic Church is not doing much. I'm wondering, have you had a chance to read the bishop's the pastoral, which will, I think, overwhelmingly be passed next month in Washington, the bishop's pastoral on the economy? I just had another thought. I'm wondering if you might...
Can you read it?
Pardon?
Can you read it? Can you live in it? The bishop's words are of no consequence to most poor people in America, because the bishops are of no consequence to most poor people in America. They will meet at the Hyatt Regency in Washington.
Yes, yeah.
That is an abomination. They no more understand poverty than the dukes of industry or the lords of government.
When the bishops are suggesting and criticizing...
They have no right to suggest anything. There's no justice in their lives. No one takes them seriously. I get people angry because there's some minimal amount of consistency in the way I live. Someone who stands up with a pair of Gucci shoes and says, pick up your cross and follow Christ, is of no consequence or significance in the lives of the people listening to them.
I think that's a generalization.
It certainly is.
Okay, thank you.
It's intended to be, and it applies to most people in the church today, most professional people in the church. The church is doing the smallest amount possible to not walk around with its head totally between its legs, in shame.
The bishop's letter, among other things, it's attempting, just hear this out, it's attempting to challenge the government, to say, let's look at the system is not working. And
The church has no right.
Please, just give me a break, okay?
Sure.
They're mentioning many of the same things you did, the homeless, the family breakdown.
Doesn't matter.
Just bear with 30 seconds.
Okay, you got it. 30 seconds. Go ahead.
60 maybe.
No, 30. You got 30. Go ahead. Come on.
The bishops are saying it's a systemic problem and that something in the system has to change. Now, I'm wondering if any of the members of the community for creative nonviolence are also attempting to speak towards systemic evils and problems so that maybe in 5 or 10 years you would not have to have a facility with 1,000 people in it being fed.
Yes, we are. The bishop's encyclical, the bishop's letters, they don't have any consequence or meaning. The church is the largest landowner in Washington, second only to the federal government. And what does it use its land for? for self-centered, selfish, narrow purposes. Who cares what the bishops say in their letter when in their lives there's no economic justice? There's a handful of bishops in America that are living the way the princes of the church are supposed to be living. There's a handful of priests in the world who are living on the streets. There's three Roman Catholic priests on this whole globe are living on the streets with people. Isn't that obscene? Yes, it is. We are not interested in the church talking about systemic change when it is lying snugly in bed with the state. They share the same values. They even have the same portfolios. Look at where their money's invested. Look at where their resources are. Look at where their heart is. It's where their treasure is, in building funds, and in buildings, and in artwork. I am a Roman Catholic. Of what relevance to me is John Paul riding around on a throne? Christ didn't ride around on a throne. Christians are not supposed to ride around on thrones or live in palaces. They're supposed to live with the least of our sisters and brothers. When they do that, then they embody the values of the Gospels and the message of the Gospels and the demands of Christ. When they don't do that, they're irrelevant to Christianity, be they bishop or priest or lay person.
I don't disagree with you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What is your community doing on that systemic level?
We're living differently, brother. What do you think systemic change is all about? We live in community. We are non-hierarchical. We have shed from our lives much of what America would consider material necessities. We spend all of our time, day and night, serving the truth in our neighbors as the gospel calls us to, and we create an example that hopefully other people will find somewhat interesting and compelling. That's all change is. Change is the way you live. Systemic change is the product of enough people living sanely and rationally, translated into structural form. That's all it's ever been.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to make a comment, and then I have a couple of questions for you. I'd like to say that I wish there were more people from the local community here tonight to hear you speak. And second of all, my question, one, did you choose Washington, D.C. because of the focal point for the United States?
No, I was living and working in New York City, and some people that I knew had become part of the Community for Creative Nonviolence and asked me to come and be part of the community there, and it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Okay. Are you seeing an increase in families on the street? I know that in Milwaukee we're seeing an increase in either single-parent families or...
All across the country, the greatest growth in the homeless population is among families.
Do you house those people in your shelter?
No, you can't mix families and single people. We have a couple of families. We don't turn anyone away, but it's not the kind of place where families would feel real comfortable, and there's proportionately very little family space available in Washington. The government, while it says that the local government in D.C., like most local governments, say that they try to keep families together, that's a lie. In Washington, it's understood that if you apply for assistance, you may lose your children. They may take them away because you're not able to care for them. And what responsible parent or parents wants to give up their children? And the answer is almost no one. So that is a way that government has of keeping families away from it, stopping them from asking for assistance.
Also, do you advocate for the chronically mentally ill that you see in your shelter?
Yeah, I mean, if yelling and screaming and fighting for resources and services is advocating, I guess we do. The most important thing we do is to love people, to be perfectly honest. I mean, advocacy is important, and resistance is important, and service is important. All those things are important, but without love, they matter not at all. If you love someone and you are trying to improve their lives and reduce their pain and their suffering because you love them, all kinds of amazing things become possible, both in terms of those relationships and structurally, systemically.
Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Oh, thank you.
I want to thank you also. Your insights have been really inspiring. The question that I have is, many people have said that racial inequality can be reduced only through education. How do you think education plays a role in homelessness?
Well, I have a profound respect for education, which is why I have a profound dislike for most institutions of higher education, because they're a contradiction in terms. I mean, a real education doesn't separate experience and knowledge, it combines the two. And in most universities and colleges, there's very little education that occurs. There's a transmittal of fact, but that's a very minimal use. Real education takes place in the way we live. We communicate our values and our understanding and our sense of history and our theology and our philosophy in the way we live. And that is the most powerful tool of education available to any human being. And I think that that is what we need to be about. In terms of education, when we live in such a way that says that all human beings, black or white, old or young, green or yellow, are equal in the eyes of God and in our eyes, then we communicate that. When we raise our children in that way, we also communicate that. I was talking to a couple earlier tonight, a professor and his wife, who teaches here, and they have 6 children. 4 of them are adopted, and I think at least 2 or 3 of them, from what they said, were racially mixed. And so you have white children growing up with children of color in the same household. That's how you deal with racism. You come to grips with it in your own home and in your own life, and in the way you work and struggle and relate to the world around you. But it's hard. It's hard because we have to confront things within ourselves that are difficult, and we have to confront things outside of ourselves that are difficult. It's like freedom. Freedom is real tough. And the First Amendment, it's a very wonderful thing. How many people are willing to let it slide away, almost in silence? For instance, here, in this university, people forbid the distribution of certain materials. That's abominable. Why aren't more teachers, why aren't more students rising up in arms? I mean, who cares what the folks who provide money to the college think? This is supposed to be a place where people have academic freedom, where ideas are free to circulate, whether we like them or not or find them threatening or not. The loss of freedom is just like the perpetuation of racial discrimination and racism. It's a product of our unwillingness to come to grips with what it means, internally and externally and structurally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to also thank you for coming. I'd like
Thank
to
you.
say that I'm very pleased that I came tonight and happy to see all the people here that are here. I wish I would have seen these people at the World Food Teleconference, which was held in this university last Thursday. There were a total of 9 people at the teleconference, which I felt was a abomination, but perhaps in response to the midterm exams that might answer some of the question regarding apathy. I'm here because I am a mother, a female, and also a dietitian for the City of Milwaukee Health Department. So the issue of hunger and the issue of poverty, particularly as it affects women and as it affects children, touches me personally, having also experienced it in my own life. I guess the question I have goes back to the teleconference, and that was regarding an issue that one of the panelists, comment that one of the panelists made, and that was that women are more strongly affected emotionally by hunger, and also that they tend to be stronger survivors of poverty and fighters against poverty in our society. Would you respond to that, and would you also comment on the percentage of women that are in your community?
Okay. Last question first. It's probably a third of our community is women. But that fluctuates. The answer would be different next week or last week or next month. I don't think women are sturdier in terms of living through poverty. I think that they, for whatever reasons, are better able to hold their families together. I think why would be somewhat easy to understand. But it's just as hard to survive if you're poor, if you're a man. Just a different kind of life. There are, of course, a disproportionate number of women living in poverty, and that's a reflection of the not just the sexist society that we live in, but the sexist administration that's controlling Washington right now, and Congress as well. I mean, it's a good old boys club, and there may be some women in there, but it's still a good old boys club, and they control policy and the flow of dollars. And somebody once said that if, somebody recently said it in Congress, that if PMS was a male disorder, if it was a male problem, would have been dealt with about 10 or 20 years ago. I don't know. It's hard to be poor, whether you're a man or a woman or a child, and it's very crushing. And I just, there's a part of me that doesn't feel comfortable in saying that women are stronger in surviving, and they're more sensitive to the implications of hunger. That may well be true, but I don't know. It's a lot of people want to visit the shelter, and we don't allow people to kind of wander through the shelter. That's not a nice thing. You're talking about people's bedrooms. But there's always, among men and women, or most times, there's a belief that men would be less hesitant to have a woman come through an area where they were not fully clothed. And I have found men to be just as shy about their persons, just as reluctant to be viewed disrobed by women as women would be by men. So I don't know if women are more sensitive to the implications and the pain of hunger, or whether they're stronger in surviving poverty. I don't know.
Can you also just answer what is being done for the children? You mentioned that a majority of the people that are homeless in the streets of New York are children.
Mm-hmm. Almost nothing is being done. What's being done is that we're raising a whole generation of people in our country who've grown up either on the streets or in shelters. And the implications of that should be as frightening as the implications of raising a whole generation of kids that don't believe that they'll die of old age because of the existence and the threat of nuclear weapons. Those are profoundly dangerous situations, and nobody is dealing with either one. Thank you. Are we almost out of time? Yes, sir.
I'll make my question and statement as brief as I can. First of all, I wanted to say that I thought it was really interesting when the young lady brought up a point about the professor from the University of Virginia, because although most Marquette students are unaware of it, a great number of the homeless people that walk around campus, especially along Wells Street, are former Marquette graduates, many of them who were extremely successful and powerful and who didn't lose any esteem, but literally tumbled down from the positions that they held. And they come back here because this is where they were in their best of times, so to speak. At any rate, my uncle was one of them, and that's why I say that. So I thought it was quite interesting that somebody brought that point up. I didn't know that it occurred in other places as well. At any rate, my question is really very simple, I guess. And basically, I've grown up in what I consider the most interesting neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and most people would call the worst. And we used to have older people there, too, that always come to mind for me. One older gentleman who used to come walking past our house every day, 7 days a week, and he'd walk by the Lutheran church that was across the way from our house and curse at it all the way down, screaming as loud as he could at this church, all the way down. Then he'd hit Cole's grocery store on Juneau, and he'd swear all the way past it, and then he was gone, and you wouldn't see him until the next morning. There was another older gentleman who used to come by, and he didn't scream at all. He just used to walk up very quietly, unzip his pants, urinate on the church, and walk away. And every day the same people came
What a profound
by.
theological statement.
And basically, my question is, first of all, these people obviously are not dangerous unto themselves, but how do you handle people that are coming into a shelter and basically have to live and survive with other people when you've got a man who will not stop yelling? I mean, this gentleman would yell for hours on end. You could hear him 3 blocks away and he was still yelling. So first of all, what do you do with people like that? And second of all, my sister's mentally handicapped, and so a great deal of my life I've spent in either heated discussions or very physical discussions with people over what is and isn't acceptable as to treating people. And I've found, especially in the college community, that it seems to be a highly prominent and socially acceptable situation to do a great deal of making jokes at or insulting, screaming at people who are in this situation. And personally, it upsets me a great deal. And I was wondering exactly how you would go about handling people in that situation, because I don't feel my solution is the best social solution.
First of all, mental disability is relative. See, in my opinion, the president, all the folks in the White House, and most of Congress are stark raving mad, and I mean that. I'm not saying that lightly or jokingly, because you have people sitting around Washington planning on how to better destroy the earth and providing money to do it. I think that is an irrational response. And I think that's a rational behavior. The concept of normalcy is an entirely fluid one. We tend to forget that people in a society get together, a dominant group gets together and decides this is acceptable behavior and this is unacceptable behavior. The reality is that generally what we call mental disability or mental illness is neither. It's simply people functioning out of a different reality. And we live in such a narrow, prejudiced, defined society that unless you look, smell, act, and talk like this, you're in trouble. Now, I meant what I said before about the Old Testament prophets, in fact, being people who would have been judged insane today. And they were no more insane then than they would be today. And people who talk to themselves or to trees or walk up and down and mumble are just different kinds of people. And it's the rejection of those people that causes the real problems. Bless you. In the shelter that we operate, has anybody ever seen the film King of Hearts? Okay. Our shelter is exactly like King of Hearts. People who walk around the floors all night because that's what they want to do. They're perfectly free to do that, as long as they don't disturb other people or disrupt other people's sleep. If somebody yells and screams, we'll find a place for them to stay where it won't bother anybody. I mean, why should we send them out to the street to die just because that's what they do? And in fact, when we accept people as they are, they wind up stopping the yelling and the screaming. I mean, that man who's urinating on that church really is making a statement about that church and the fact that that church allows him to walk by every day and to live his life out on the streets. And that kind of behavior changes fairly rapidly when people are in an environment where they're accepted for who they are. We have people on our staff who are adjudged mentally disabled. They weren't at all. We had one man who started coming into the soup kitchen about 4 or 5 years ago. His name is Mansell. When Mansell started coming in, he would stand in the corner and he would howl like an animal, like a wild animal. And he stood there day after day for months, just kind of howling. And everybody went about their business. And one day somebody walked by and Mansell said, "I'd like to help." And so they handed him a broom. And so for months, Mansell stood around and swept one small portion of that soup kitchen. Today, Mansell has a car and an apartment, and he's doing reasonably well. And it's not attributable to drugs or medication or to psychoanalysis. It's attributable to people loving Mansell and allowing Mansell to be Mansell and not demanding that he be like them because he's not like them. And again, we've discovered the same thing, that the problem isn't with people who are, quote, mentally disabled. The problem is with people who believe that because those folks are different than they are, that in some way they're to be excluded or rejected or abused. And everything changes when the attitude changes. I appreciate your sharing that about your uncle. I would also I have some friends here, people who I met a year ago when I went to St. Norbert's College, who drove down here a couple of 100 miles. And they drove down because in part they heard that you all were going to open a shelter down here, and they were kind of hoping that they would be the first in Wisconsin as a university to do that, as a college. And they didn't seem to be any real risk of that from what I've heard. But I would strongly encourage people in this university to reach out in a more defined and structured way to the folks who live around this university, whether it's by creating a space for shelter or creating a place where people can go in and out of, or a place where people can get a change of clothes or get some food or something. I think it's criminal for this university to contain, 12,000 students, to be in the middle of the city with a lot of people around the university that are out on the streets, and most of the interaction, from what I hear, is not a particularly positive or hopeful one. But you have an opportunity here to do something and to take it out of the abstract and to set an example for other universities and other colleges that say that, there is a connection between real life and the life that goes on in our university. And there is a need to reach out to the people around us, particularly when you live in the middle of a city. Most colleges and universities are placed in the same place that most prisons are, which is far away, out in the woods somewhere where you never have to come in contact with it or it with you. Thank you.
How is your community supported?
small donations and what I get paid for speaking. Our budget is approximately $250,000 a year. Probably the largest budget in America for an organization that doesn't get either foundation funds or government funds for operating. I get paid what I consider an inordinate amount of money for speaking, but that money goes into the operation of the community, as does small donations. And we live by faith. We're essentially a community of faith. Before we opened up this very big shelter, our budget was about $1,500 a month. The month after we opened that building, our budget went to $15,000 a month. None of us can still figure out how that's happened, where the money's come from. I mean, $150,000 came when Hollywood decided to buy the rights for the film. But that was only $150,000. And I still don't know where the money comes from that pays our bills. I mean, the electric bill at the shelter alone is $5,000 a month. When you're serving a couple thousand people a day and you're paying rent and utilities on 5 buildings and you're maintaining a fleet of raggedy old cars, about 15 of them that people have donated, when you're paying for telephones and all of that's a lot of money. And it comes from the same place that all good things come from if we let it, which is God. But that's how we live. We live by faith, and the money comes from up there via people down here.
Mitch, I need one more comment. For those that are not in Milwaukee, there's a shelter on 19th and Wells, the Salvation Army. It's just able, because the Pettits have their space now, which is incredibly ironic, you know, all this wealth and millions of people. Yeah. Second of all, I volunteer at the library Saturdays and on weekends, and so I have a chance to be in the presence of people, and it's given me, let me just identify myself. I am one of those mentally ill people, okay? 6 years ago, I had my break, and I was homeless for a while, and it's brought me really in touch with reality and a lot of stuff. But anyhow, I'm doing volunteer work in between, looking for work. I have a degree from Alberta, believe it or not, but I have been able to be more sensitive to the people, especially that come to the library downtown here in Milwaukee, because I'm at the welcome desk on some days, and I talk to them. If I have nothing else, you know, and I don't want to blow this up, but it's just little things like talking. Mm-hmm. So there is a shelter, and I think there's something on 23rd on the north side, whatever, that one. So there is things being done.
I know.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I think we should probably wrap this up. I would strongly encourage people to buy a book so I don't have to carry them back to Washington. Thank you.